Begin Self-Publishing, episode number 7. Editing. It's not magic fairy dust.
Interested in self-publishing but don't know where to start? Want to get your book onto Amazon? Want to hold your paperback book in your hands? Learn how on the Begin Self-Publishing podcast with your host, Tim Lewis.
One of the main problems people have when they discuss editing, in terms of the process of editing an ebook or a paperback book, is the fact that there are actually many different types of editing, and each editor tends to play down or not understand the role of the other editors in the process. The common man in the street knows what editing means. To them, it's just making sure there aren't typos or grammatical errors in a piece of text, whereas in reality, for longer documents, there are many other roles that are required in the editing process. From a publisher's point of view, there are 3 main types of editor. Developmental editing, which is probably the most expensive and possibly the most rewarding style. There's copy editing, and there's proofreading. There are also ancillary functions, which I would say go beyond the development side of editing into almost writing the piece for somebody else, of ghostwriters and copywriters. In terms of developmental editing, this is about improving the actual structure of the document and the writing style. This has really nothing to do with grammar or spelling or continuity or any of the other things that copying, editing and proofing will require. This is helping somebody to improve the style of their writing in terms of suggestions, in terms of a document. This can help somebody make their book more marketable, improve the story structure if it's a fiction work, and generally the writing style, and helping people to actually write better. Copy editing is closer towards what most people think of a traditional editing role. They are looking for grammar, to some extent spelling and mistakes, and also continuity, and possibly legal issues. What do I mean by this? Well, continuity, let's say you write a novel, and in chapter 2, there's a guy called Jack Smith who dies a horrible death. But he's a fairly minor character, and you haven't really, you've forgotten about him or what he did in chapter 2. Then in chapter 75, you happen to write that Jack Smith has a very bad day, forgetting that you've killed him off in chapter 2. This is what's called a continuity error. Jack should already be dead, but you've forgotten that you've killed him off. Now, usually it's not as big as bringing back a character who's dead. This becomes a lot more of an issue for novels and books where there are multiple timelines and you're jumping back and forth and there's all sorts of other things going on. And there can be issues with historical accuracy in books. So let's say you set your book in the 1980s and then suddenly somebody pulls out an iPhone. This would be a continuity error. Copy editors are very good at spotting these kinds of issues and helping you with them. Some copy editors will even provide some level of support in terms of helping you avoid legal issues. For example, where you quote from songs and things which will cause you to be potentially infringed by copyright issues. The problem with many people have with editing, myself included, in that depending on who you talk to, which role of editor should do which thing is a little bit nebulous. A lot of people on the development side of editing play down the role of copy editing. A lot of people on the copy editing side will no doubt play down the role of development editing. Proofreading is really a term that applies based on the old world of paper publishing. These are literally the people who check the last proof that goes to the printer, both in terms of those last-minute spelling errors and also for layout, in terms of how the pages are laid out and making sure that there aren't any issues with it. Again, this definition issue can be a problem. Many people assume that the proof editors are going to do all the grammar and other checking that a copy editor will do. Most traditional copy editors will be used to having some sort of proofreader after them to do a final check for spelling errors and other issues in the document. This can cause issues if you hire an editor and you hire the wrong sort, or you hire one editor but you forget about the other roles. Many from a traditional publishing background would say that you have to hire one of every kind of editor for your book. I'm not sure that this is really practical for many indie authors to do, and I'm not sure that you actually would know many who would hire both an editor for the developmental editing and a copy editor and somebody for proofreading. Really what you want is somebody who's a more general editor. I'm sure these people exist and are available, but you need to be careful when you're looking at editors to make sure that you know exactly what people are saying they're going to do and what they're specialised in. Some people will set themselves up as editors because there is nothing to stop anybody calling themselves an editor, and really just be offering a proofreading, minor copy editing service just for grammar and spelling.
You're listening to the Begin Self-Publishing Podcast with Tim Lewis.
Even more high level than most of the kinds of editing is the world of ghostwriters and copywriters. Copywriter tends to be somebody who writes shorter copy. A ghostwriter is somebody who literally will write a book for you. Depending on how much involvement you actually have with the ghostwriter, this can seem like an extreme version of the editing of the other kind. If you're telling somebody what to write and they take that and produce it into a book, they are a ghostwriter. But if somebody needs an awful lot of editing support because their English is not great, or they haven't really got any idea how to structure a story or a non-fiction book, then an editor can often end up as a ghostwriter almost by default. My own personal editing pattern is very much a don't do what I do what I say kind of perspective. My mum does my editing, which I always say isn't as bad as it sounds, because she used to work in publishing, admittedly in the 1960s. However, I would not say that I would recommend getting one person you know to edit your books for you. We've managed to make up for maybe a lack of skill in developmental editing by just taking an awful long time over editing my books. It helps to have shorter books for editing. Because I'm using my mum to edit my books, we'll typically do 5 or 6 passes over each book rather than the typical 2 or 3 that you would get with, say, a professional editor. I'm sure you could pay for more passes with a professional editor, but costs do start to stack up. Something I wouldn't necessarily recommend to anybody, though it is an option, is to try and do the editing yourself. The reason for this is that it's extremely hard to see the faults in your own work. Anybody looking at it is better than just you looking at it yourself. You may be the best person in terms of grammar and spelling in the world, but you will still make mistakes because grammar and structure is a very difficult area to get right. And also it is very subjective. Unlike the French, where they have the Académie Française, they have a body that determines the language structure of the French language. The English language has nothing like this. There are various schools of thought in terms of how English should be structured, like Oxford English and Chicago Star Manual, the BBC and The Economist, and various other people will have their own style guides. They are really a style. It's very easy to think that there is one right rule for most grammar in the English language. But there are huge variations even between Canadian, American and British English. And then there are various schools of thought as to how you annotate and write particular words. It can vary between the US and the UK, and even between individual books and publishing houses. The main thing is to be consistent and try to follow a style that is similar, if not identical, to one of the other styles. You'll hear a lot of people say things like, you must use the Oxford comma, or you must not use the Oxford comma, you must capitalise these words in this way. You literally have to take a view and stick to it. Something that I use, which I recommend everybody to use, regardless of what editing style you use, is to use some text-to-speech software and literally go through your manuscript and hear it read out back to you. This will bring out a lot of the issues with it not sounding right. It will also make an awful lot of the simple typo errors, which are very often missed, much more obvious. I've had a look at some of the automated online grammar programs, things like Grammarly and the like. I'm not sure they're really there yet. Something else that lots of indie authors use is as almost a cheap way of doing editing on either the copy editing side or maybe from a development side, is to use beta readers. These are literally a load of people who get to see a copy of your manuscript before it's freely available. This is especially useful if you've already got an existing collection of people who like your previous books in a particular genre. By providing it for beta readers, they will be very good at spotting continuity errors and also errors with the structure and markability of the manuscript. You can also use them at a later stage to pick up typo and grammatical errors. However, as I've discovered myself when I lent out early editions of my first Time Shock novella to people, if they find spelling errors, they may well interpret that as a sign of a low quality document. I asked somebody for a review and they said, no, but it's got typing errors in it. And the point I would have made to them is that they only had 3 typing errors in the whole 20,000 word document, and I corrected them after they said that. So there can be a reputational risk if you give a document to beta readers too soon. But they can certainly play a role in terms of saving money on editing. Another point I would make in terms of editing is that I think that if you've planned out your novel or your non-fiction book correctly in the first place, you will reduce an awful lot of the errors that you will get if you just write it in what's called a pantsing style on the seat of your pants, i.e. you just sit down and write something without any major forethought. Similarly, if you write very quickly, then you're more likely to remember things as you're writing the book than if you write over a prolonged period of time. If you write your book over 2 years, you're almost certain to make major continuity and other errors in your book, where you have repeating sections or you have characters who resurrect themselves from the dead, all sorts of unusual things that you would never have thought of. So generally speaking, the larger and the longer you took to write a novel or a non-fiction book, and how much planning you put into a novel will affect how much and how expensive the editing will be required to make it into a good product. How much editing you choose to pay for your manuscript is very much a personal decision. I feel that everybody should have at least one outside person looking at their document. I'm not sure that really you can expect friends and other people to do the job for you, unless they've had some experience however long ago in editing and they really like you, because it is an extreme time commitment. Editing is expensive because it takes a long time, especially if you're talking about longer books. It's the old trade-off between time, quality and money. It's still going to take a long time, but if you pay somebody money to do it, then they'll be doing it rather than you. But one of the unique and horrible things about editing is that you still will have a whole load of suggestions come back from an editor that you'll have to spend time on, however much money you spend on it. Obviously, the no money, no time option is to have a low quality document with loads of spelling mistakes and other issues with it. I have read these as self-published books. I've also read traditionally published books which tend to have more issues with actually typos than anything else. Often the copy editing side will be alright, but the copy editor, for whatever reason, has missed loads of typographical issues with spelling. One of the things that may well surprise you is that how easy it is to miss spelling mistakes. When I've been going through my 5 or 6 pass editing with my mum, I often find errors in pass 5 or 6. It always amazes me. They tend to be issues where you couldn't hear the incorrect word from reading it out. So it'll be something like use the wrong kind of there or spelling of there in a particular situation. The error seems to appear a lot, where you finish one line and then you put the on the next line and it ends up as the. That's quite a common error as well. My recommendation would be to work out the kind of area that you need editing help the most. If you're not a particularly good writer but you're passionate about a subject, then having help in the development editing side of things may well be worth the investment. This will help your book to be a much better book. If you're fairly confident that you know how to generally structure a book and you think your grammar is quite good, then maybe spending more on a proofreader, or probably what would be called a proof copy editor, would be the best place to spend your money. There's lots of ways to save money on editing, but I never ever recommend trying to do it yourself. I suppose if you spent about 50 edits trying to edit your own novel or non-fiction document and it wasn't particularly long, it might work. For example, I wouldn't suggest that somebody has an editor for editing their tweets, because it's only 140 characters. And if your book is only, say, like 10 pages, then you may well be able to edit it yourself. But once you start getting over 50 pages of text, it gets much, much harder to edit your own document. I really would suggest, unless you're talking about very short novellas or very short non-fiction books, hiring in or some way or other getting editing help with your document. And if you're talking about a 200,000 or 300,000 word epic, you almost certainly would want to get 2 or 3 editors involved, in my opinion. This is why I prefer shorter fiction. Ultimately, the choice is yours. In terms of how to find an editor, this is obviously not something that I've done myself. If you're requiring somebody more for the copy editing or the proofreading side of things, then I think the idea of giving them some kind of test with deliberate errors in it may be a more sensible way to go. For somebody on the development side of editing, I'm not sure that this will really buy you very much. For this, you probably want to just give them a sample of your work, which hopefully they'll accept for free, which they can provide comments about, and then you can have a look at the various editors' comments and check whether they are something that you agree with or something that is just their personal opinion. The trouble with this kind of editing is that you can end up with an editor who tries to enforce their particular prejudices onto your manuscript. So let's say that you wrote a vampire novel, but it hasn't got any werewolves in it. The editor, for some reason, is obsessed with Twilight and insists that you have to add werewolves to the document to make it marketable. This might be somebody to avoid. If you try and stick with the professional editing organisations, such as I believe it's called PEN in the US, and the Society for Editors and Proofreaders in the UK, you'll probably be assured of a higher level of professionalism to avoid this kind of error, rather than just somebody you've managed to find on some online site where claims proofreading or editing by the word. I would, like with all things in life, I would try and get an editor to edit something small that you do, just to check that they are going to do a good job on your novel or non-fiction book. If you're happy with that, then you can scale up to the bigger series of novels that you're going to do or the non-fiction books you're going to do. But don't think that it's just simply a job of hiring somebody to check your grammar and spelling. Because unless it's a very short document, there will be much more involved in the editing process than that. The reason why I said that this episode is editing is not magic fairy dust is that there does seem to be a bit of an idea in some circles that if you have this expensive array of editors working for you, then instantaneously your manuscript will be converted into something best-selling and wonderful. Clearly, to me, this is not the case. Editing in any form is a lot of work for whoever does it. By outsourcing it, you are reducing that amount of work that's required. But you're never ever going to be able to hire somebody who's just magically going to be able to transform your book into a bestseller just by changing the text of it to make it better. Editing can and does help improve the quality of most documents. But anybody who says that editing is the thing that makes a novel is a fool. It's simply a form of quality control that if you want to compete in today's world of self-publishing, you're probably going to need to have very robust methods and processes to help you get your book edited. For the more observant of you who've been to my beginselfpublishing.com website may have noticed that on episode 2 I put a video documenting how to release your ebook to the KDP service. You'll no doubt be glad to hear that I've now done this. I'll include a link to this in the show notes. Talk to you guys next week.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed today's show, please stop by iTunes and rate and leave a review. This helps make the show more visible. For free resources, show notes, and other helpful content, join the community at beginselfpublishing.com.